In the last episode, we managed to buy this rusty and neglected bike for just £30 and plenty of problems thrown in for free. In this episode, we'll see if we can give this bike a new lease of life and try and sell it for a profit to put into the next project bike, with the aim of eventually flipping our way up to an e-bike that I plan to surprise my dad with in just a couple of months' time. So after we stripped the bike down in the last episode, I wanted to take the time to clean up the parts to see what was reusable and what needed replacement. The first thing to clean and service was these rusty Suntour suspension forks. I realised I didn't have the tool to remove the top parts holding the fork together, but this is where a 3D printer comes in really handy, as I had the tool within just 40 minutes, rather than having to wait for one to be delivered. When removing the lower bolts, I quickly realised how much water was trapped in these forks, which completely soaked the garage floor with rusty, stagnant water. I was just really hoping that the internals of these forks weren't completely rusted through, as we only had a budget of £50 to restore this bike, and replacing the forks would completely blow our budget out the water, and put us at risk of making no profit for all of our hard work. To my horror, the springs were coated in a thick mucus of emulsified grease, but I wiped this off and was relieved to find that they were in fact free of rust and could be used again. The stanchions and steerer tube, however, had not fared the onslaught of water quite so well. So I'm going to have to try and bring these stanchions back to usable condition by removing as much of the rust as possible. While I do that, I just want to take an opportunity to say a huge thank you to those of you who supported the last episode. I was blown away with how many of you left helpful comments and subscribed to the channel, so I really hope you enjoy watching this series as much as I'm enjoying making it. I started by just using WD-40 and a scouring pad to get rid of any old grease and the surface rust. I was pretty shocked actually at how much this alone was able to bring up the stanchions to a nice polished condition. One of the commenters on the last episode, Kevin, helpfully suggested that we used Evaporust to try and remove the corrosion. I applied this to the worst areas, and while this did do a good job of removing the rust from the steerer tube, I do think the parts need to be soaked in this stuff to remove the really deep-seated corrosion. After I was happy that I'd removed as much of the rust and the gunk from the internals of this fork as possible, I set about greasing and reassembling it, ready to be used on the final bike. I then took my box of components outside to have a deep clean, so using brushes and rags to really get into the parts that needed it. While some needed quite a bit of work to make them looking fine again, others came up really nice with a relatively minimal amount of effort. One of the components that I wanted to try and save was this chain, so I soaked it in Evaporust for 2 days. While I was impressed with the amount of rust that this substance was able to remove, I eventually decided it probably wasn't worth continuing, but I'll be keeping this chain for spares to use in future projects. Now that I was confident about the list of components that I needed, I set about measuring and ordering the required parts. Rather than just use Amazon, I tried to use physical bike shops that had an online eBay store, which actually ended up being cheaper than Amazon anyway. So stick around until the end to find out exactly how much I spent on these new parts. While I waited for those parts to arrive, I set about cleaning the lovely silver frame to get it looking its best again. I used a combination of degreaser and a mild abrasive to try and remove the dust and the small scratches and imperfections in the paintwork. There was a few areas where the damage was too much to try and repair, but in the end I was really happy with how the frame came up. One of the parts that we found huge issues with in the last episode was the rear wheel, specifically that the axle had completely sheared in half. The main concern here was that we'd potentially have to replace the entire back wheel, and that would be incredibly expensive. But luckily I was able to find a replacement axle for a very reasonable price, although I did make a mistake when measuring, and so I had to order 2. So definitely a lesson there, measure twice and buy once. And finally, after all that work, it was time to put the bike together. I know many of you enjoyed the clips in the last episode of me working on the bike without the commentary, so check the series playlist next week for the extended restoration video without me talking in the background. And after about 10 hours worth of hard graft, here is the final product. Right, so I'm really happy with how this bike has turned out in the end. It went from a very rusty, loose, worn out machine to something that I think has now got a real lease of life. So the forks, as you can see, the visible part, the upper parts, came up really nicely. There was some patches of the lower part that you can't see that were more difficult to remove, and I did get as much out as I possibly could. But having done some research online, I think that is actually acceptable and they should still function perfectly fine. The steerer tube as well, that was a little bit rusted. So again, removed as much of that as I could before installation. I think that should be fine. It shouldn't rust too much more as long as this bike is stored correctly. New brake pads installed. They actually grab really nicely because I've cleaned all the rim up as well using scouring pad. Changed the grips to some new ones. I think they actually look pretty smart, those do, with the anodized red locking grips. So as you can see, I've put this cheaper saddle on there, but I've had these before and they've lasted fine. At least, you know, if you do need to replace it, they're not massively expensive. So I've got the chain at a good deal. So I was happy to replace that in the end because actually, having rode the bike, it does ride a lot better with a brand new chain on it. One of the main deliberations I had on this bike was whether to change the tyres. So as you can see, you know, they're getting a little bit low on tread on the main portion of the tyre there. And so I did wonder about actually replacing them. You know, that was kind of my main aim, was to bring this bike up to an almost new standard. But having looked at the price of tyres, which are just crazy at the moment, really my options were replace the tyres with some expensive ones and risk having no profit at all. Do I replace them with cheaper tyres, but then the bike has got cheap tyres on it? Or do I just save myself the effort of ordering them and the risk, and I'll just sell them as is? I say in the description that there's not really too much life left in the tyres and they'll need to be replaced. And then at least the next owner has got the option of what tyres they decide to put in it, rather than me just deciding for them. You're going to have cheap new tyres on. You know, especially if this bike is only going to be ridden on road, they might even want to put slicks on them, or they might just want to keep on running these if they're happy with probably the limited puncture protection that's going to offer now. While the sun was out, I took the opportunity to get some really nice photos of the bike and list it for sale before the weekend arrived. Right, so it's less than 24 hours since I put the listing online, and to be honest with you, I've had a ton of attention in the bike. Now, that's probably down to the high quality photos that I took and the honest and accurate description that I gave of the bike as well. Now, I have the usual time wasters that just put in silly offers that I just ignored, but there was one guy in particular who seemed super keen on the bike, and he actually ended up buying it, and I've literally just dropped it off with him right now. So, how much did we spend on the bike? How much did we sell it for? And crucially, how much profit did we make to roll into the next project? So if you remember, we started with an original budget of £100, and the bike itself, in pretty bad condition, cost just £30. We then needed a new axle for the rear wheel. That was a lot cheaper than I was expecting, at just £5.98. But I did have to buy two of those because I measured it wrong and ended up ordering the wrong thing. But I didn't want to return it because it was a local bike shop, so I'll just eat that cost. Next, a set of new inner and outer cables was just £6.49. A pack of bearings for the rear wheel was £3.10. The grips came to £5.25.
New brake pads £4.59, a new saddle was £6.49, and a brand new chain was only £7.99. So in total, we spent £39.89 on the bike. But if we just round that up to £40, we were £70 into the bike, which meant that we had £30 cash plus the bike in its done-up condition. I then listed the bike for sale at £140, and the guy who bought it was more than happy to pay the full price, which means in total, our total cash for the next project is £170, and that last project made us £70 profit, so 50% profit margin. So with the new £170 budget, I want you to tell me in the comments what bike you think I should buy next.